thank you everybody for being here together with us today. We look forward to a great 90 minutes together around this really important topic.
Hi friends, so good to be together today. It'd be a lot better to be in person, but what a great privilege it is to even have this experience online. So let's start our time in prayer together. Lord Jesus, King of the universe, creator of all of us and all things, we thank you that you are present wherever we are. You're present in our homes, in our places of assembly, yes, in hospital rooms and places where people need your healing and are journeying through the life that you have given them. I thank you for Dr. Guretzki and his availability today. Just bless this time as we listen in, and we're listening to you as well, Lord. So speak to us and journey with us through this time. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. David Guretzki didn't send me his biography, so I'm just going to make something up right now. No, I won't. I did get something for him, and he can correct me if I make some mistakes. But presently, at least for the next 7 to 8 days, he is the executive vice president and resident theologian with the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And he has previously served on the board. Effective January 31st, Bruce Clemenger will be appointed to a new role as Senior Ambassador and President Emeritus of the EFC, and David will then move from his current role to become the EFC's CEO and President. David grew up and came to know the Lord in Onaway Evangelical Free Church in Alberta. And he served as assistant pastor in Lacombe, Alberta, in the Evangelical Free Church, as well as he then pursued further education and joined the faculty at Briarcrest in Saskatchewan, where he helped equip people for ministry until 2017, when he moved to the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And so as well, just to let you know, David is married to Maureen, and they have 3 children, 2 adults and 1 teenager. And when David manages to find a few spare moments, he is involved in astrophotography, amateur radio, reading novels, and woodworking. And as I understand it, if you want to stay online at the end of our time together today, David will take you on a tour of his woodworking shop. So I think that's all I have, David. I'll turn it over to you.
That last part will be very disappointing, considering that it's mostly all scattered around here and there, not really set up. But thanks, Brian. So good to be here with all of you. I won't mention any names, including some of those of my former students that I'm seeing here, because I don't want to embarrass anyone. But thank you for the warm welcome. This has been a fantastic experience. Harold Johnsrud approached me, I don't know how long ago, maybe 18 months ago already, it seems, 12 to 18 months ago, to talk about this project, working with the MCC and developing a position on MAiD, a position paper of sorts. And hopefully you've all had a chance at least to read the shorter version. The longer version very much turned into a long version. I think they managed to compress the paper down into some very fine print and make it about 20 pages, but I think in a Word document it was about 50 pages. So this is an area that I've had a surprisingly amount of experience working in. It's not an area that I would have chosen to work in, but somehow providentially God has kind of led me into this direction. You can see a little bit more at the end of the paper If you have the long paper, there's a few more notes about my involvement. It really all started back in 2015, just before the MAiD laws came into existence here in Canada. They were actually being debated, and there was already court cases happening. I was still living in Saskatchewan, and I was called upon to give an affidavit on behalf of sort of an evangelical perspective on physician conscience relative to medical assistance in dying. So for the Ontario Superior Court here, so there was 2 cases that I was involved in. That's kind of where it all started, and it's just continued now. It's almost astounding that I've been working at this now for 7-8 years on this topic. I recently did a graduate program in bioethics at St. Paul University here in Ottawa, and I focus most of my work around this topic of MAiD as well. So the real challenge for me was keeping it to 50 pages. And that was even getting to that point, I felt like there's just so much more to be said. But I hope that this is beneficial to you. I've got a slideshow that I'll be using in the presentation. And just for your awareness, I'm assuming some of you have probably read the paper, but also assuming some of you haven't had a chance. So rather than reading the paper, which would take definitely the whole 90 minutes or more, we can't do that. So I'm going to try and just bring some of the high points of the paper, and more or less what I'll outline in the presentation today are really kind of high points from the paper. And so then if you miss something, you can just jump into the paper and you'll get the fuller version. So yeah, the title of the paper is MAiD in Canada, Toward a Faithful Christian Response to Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia. And so in terms of the outline, what I want to do is along the lines of what the paper does, we'll define some terms to start with. I'll give you a brief summary. Some people are still a little bit surprised about where we're at legally in Canada relative to MAiD. So I'll do a quick summary of how we got there. A short presentation on the biblical theological framework that I used. I tried to really compress it down so that it wasn't too long and extensive, but tried to bring down to some basic points that we can almost use as talking points when we're talking about a response to MAiD. There's 7 statements that are part of the paper. I'll probably go through those quickly because it's kind of a proposed theological position. I try to distill it all down to about 7 kind of extended statements that can kind of be used for discussion. I'm assuming the denomination is going to be continuing to discuss this. And then we'll finalize. There's lots and lots of implications. There's no possible way we'll be able to cover them all. But hopefully I'll probably focus a little bit more on the pastoral and the caregiver implications, although the paper covers a lot more than that. So with that, we'll just get going. It's actually pretty important for us right off the bat to make sure that we understand the definitions. I remember years and years ago, I was a student at Briarcrest myself, and I was undergraduate program, and I took a Christian ethics class. And I remember in that ethics class, this would have been back in about 1987 or 88, kind of dates me. I remember us talking about euthanasia. It was the first time I'd ever heard the word. And I thought to myself, oh, we'll never get there. We'll never, ever have to deal with that in Canada. And, fast forward some 30, 35 years later, and Canada is now sort of the quote unquote world leader when it comes to euthanasia. So we've heard about, Holland and Belgium and so on in past decade or so, and the regimes of euthanasia there. We're already ahead. We've already leapfrogged ahead of them in terms of the ability to go ahead and have euthanasia done here. But just to make sure that we're clear on terms, there's 2 terms in particular that are pretty important. The first is, of course, euthanasia. The word euthanasia actually literally means good death. Thanatos is from the Greek, literally means good death. In philosophy, it used to mean discussion about how to die well, right? But now it's taken on such a very, very different kind of connotation. And currently, when we talk about euthanasia, and this is on page 2 of the paper, I've defined it as the intentional act of ending a person's life, usually in response to a person's terminal illness and or intolerable suffering. Euthanasia usually presumes the full consent of the patient. In some of the older ethics, they don't use the term as much anymore, but voluntary euthanasia. Though there are places in the world where ethics of non-voluntary euthanasia is being seriously debated. I don't think there's anywhere yet that has formally adopted a legal framework for non-voluntary euthanasia, but there are places where undoubtedly it's already happening. And I would say that's even happening probably here in Canada. But of course, technically, it's still illegal. A person must give consent in Canada to have their lives ended. So there's euthanasia. Another word that's often used, and it's not exactly the same, is the word assisted suicide. Lots of people tend to think that these are exactly the same, and they're not quite the same. At least here in Canada, we distinguish between the two. And assisted suicide is providing persons a means by which they might end their own life by their own hand. This is usually accomplished through a provision of deadly pharmaceuticals and an apparatus by which persons choose the time of their death and then administer the drugs themselves, usually under supervision of a medical professional. So euthanasia, in euthanasia, when we're talking technically about that, the patient consents, but in the process is fully passive. They just receive the pharmaceutical, they don't do anything, and their lives are ended. In assisted suicide, the patient actually has some kind of apparatus, some kind of medication, usually under medical supervision, and they provide the medication or the pharmaceutical by themselves through their own hand. I think I'll mention a little bit later, most people in Canada don't receive assisted suicide, they receive euthanasia. And so way the predominance is euthanasia. Very few people are opting to kind of do the procedure themselves through an assisted suicide. Of course, the terminology here in Canada has become the phrase that we use as medical assistance in dying, or MAiD. Unfortunate choice of term, if you ask me. It's taking what I think is actually, a real tragic thing, a kind of ethically terrible kind of thing, and has euphemized it and used this term medical assistance in dying, which I think is actually part of our challenge. Is there's a kind of a sanitization of what it is that's actually happening, but I'll talk a little bit about that later. But MAiD is the formal terminology that we've adopted here in Canada, both in the legal and the medical communities, and it encompasses both euthanasia, physician-induced death, and assisted suicide, where the physician provides oversight, but the patient does it themselves. Practically, as I said, only a small handful, less than 10 a year, of MAiD recipients are assisted suicide. Now, I haven't seen the 2022 numbers yet. Each year, the government does have to provide a report on, it's quite an extensive report, and you can go and find it. I think in your footnotes to the paper, there's a link to the 2021 Stats Canada report on MAiD. And I believe in 2020 or 2021, I'm just going from memory, only 7 people chose to receive assisted death through assisted suicide. That means like less than 0.1% of people are opting for assisted suicide. So practically speaking, the Canadian regime and practice is a practice of euthanasia. It's not a practice of assisted suicide. It's I don't know how much to make of that distinction. I think there's interesting things that need to be explored. The question of why is it that people obviously are hesitant to do this through an assisted suicide means, and instead are opting almost 100% of the time to have a doctor or a medical professional do the deed on their behalf. They don't want to do it themselves. They want someone else. I think there's something really significant theologically, ethically going on there. There's still seems to be a natural hesitancy towards ending one's own life at one's own hand, right? And I think we need to do more exploration about why that's happening. I want to take just a few minutes just to catch you up to date on how we got here legally in Canada. The medical assistance in dying became legal in Canada in 2016. And between 2016 and 2021, 31,664 people have opted for MAiD. So I haven't seen the 2022 stats though. However, you can see, if I had a graph here, you could see how sharply the graph is going to be going up to the right. In 2016 would be, and it wasn't, I think it was a pretty close to a full year, but not quite a full year. There was 1,018 MAiD deaths in 2018. By 2021, there were 10,000 deaths by MAiD. So in the course of 5 years, we basically saw, you know, a significant jump. And so we're increasing at approximately 2,000. I think 2017 was about 3,000, 2018 was about 5,000, and so on to 2021, where we're just over 10,000. So, and 2022 is going to see, I would predict 2022 will be kind of a geometric carry on of the graph. However, what's really rather frightening is it's 2023. We'll talk about that in a second. The access to MAiD is opening up much wider. And so I would expect by the end of 23, the numbers will actually jump more sharply at the end of 2023, unfortunately. My clicker here is not always working, so. It's not advancing for me. There we go. Not sure why it's not advancing. So really quickly, the quick kind of legal trajectory here. This all kind of goes back to, well, it actually goes back to the late 60s, I believe, or early 70s when Canada decriminalized suicide. Actually, it might be a surprise. There was a time when suicide and an attempted suicide was covered by the criminal code. You could actually be charged with a crime for attempting suicide. I think you'd have a hard time charging someone who successfully did it, but an attempted suicide could actually be charged with a crime. It was decriminalized, of course, because if someone is trying to commit suicide, that, you know, the worst thing you could do is to charge them when they recover. And so that it's understandable why it was decriminalized. That led then to kind of further discussion. Then in 1993, Sue Rodriguez, I believe she had MLS, ALS, and she challenged the ban on assisted suicide. That went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And in 93, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled a split decision, 5-4, to maintain the legal status quo, to maintain the ban on assisted suicide. But by then, the door had been opened because it was a split decision. That led to a bunch of other cases in between, but a really important case started in BC in 2011, the Carter case, and that wound its way up through to the Supreme Court. There was a couple of people, one died before they got to the Supreme Court, but Carter also had, you know, an extreme chronic illness, and was also asking to have that ban removed. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that prohibition against physician suicide, assisted suicide, was unconstitutional, and they gave Parliament 12 months. They gave them a bit of an extension, but I think it took about 16 or 18 months to create the legislation to deal with the Supreme Court ruling. That led, of course, to the 2016 legislation, Bill C-14, which made MAiD legal in Canada. And with the main provision, so at the time when Bill C-14 was when MAiD first became legal in Canada, it was that a person's death needed to be reasonably foreseeable, so reasonably foreseeable death. Just a little quick side note here. I think I do deal with it in the paper. It's important to understand how this actually worked in terms of legislation. Basically, the Bill C-14 changed the criminal code, which describes homicide. And because in the criminal code, there was no exception to a physician ending someone's life. So homicide, of course, remains illegal in Canada, but Bill C-14 basically adds provisions, qualifications, that under certain circumstances, physicians are exempt from homicide if it is done as a medical assisted death. So that's really how it is. It wasn't like it was a new law. It was that the criminal code had to be altered in order to allow physician assisted suicide to occur, and so that physicians and medical professionals would not be legally culpable for what they actually did. That carried on to a review of the bills of the legislation. Then in 2021, we had Bill C-7, and that was as a result of a Superior Court ruling in Quebec, which declared that the existing legislation was too narrowly construed. It was too narrow, that only people whose death was reasonably foreseeable could access MAiD. And so Bill C-7 opened the door to those with non-terminal illness, with people whose death was not reasonably foreseeable, and also opened the door to those with mental health issues alone. Now that is a clause that was inserted. They weren't ready to legislate it. It is already legislation, but it doesn't take effect until March 2023, which is only, what, a month and a half away when that will take effect. That's why I said that I would suspect that by the end of 2023, we're going to see a jump in the numbers, because now those with mental health issues alone, that is someone without any kind of other chronic illness, could be eligible to apply for MAiD. And right now, thankfully there is some pause. They're trying to make sure that the regulations are put in place as to safeguards as to how this is all going to work, but it is a bit of a nightmare, because the door has already been opened. It's already legislated. Really, the only issue left is either completely new legislation stopping it, which isn't likely, or that the rules and regulations need to be clarified quickly in anticipation of this taking effect in March. The other thing that was considered out of the at the time that Bill C-7 was introduced was that the federal government at that time was considering also opening expansion of MAiD to mature minors, that is people under the age of 18, who are considered to be sufficiently mature to make a MAiD choice on their own. So that is, they don't need their parents' consent. Now that doesn't mean that everybody would get that, but they're basically talking about that. So that's not yet legal, but that is something that is seriously being considered at this time, which, boy, when I hear that, that's just really, really scary. Currently in Canada, you can have a mature minor making medical decisions on their own under certain circumstances. So it's not exactly that that's brand new, but that's quite a different thing than talking about emancipated youth, a 16-year-old youth who's maybe been emancipated, who's making medical decisions on their own, versus a 12-year-old, some are talking as young as 12 or 11-year-old, making a decision about ending their own life. So it's quite concerning, and I think we just need to be praying in particular about that. Rather depressing too. So that takes us to where we're at right now. In my paper, I talk a little bit about the cultural factors that led to us going back a little bit further into history. We don't have time to look at that. Hopefully you'll be able to look at that. But as I developed then, like, how do we respond to this? And I've thought long and hard about this, obviously. And when it really comes down to it, I think that I came to realize that although there's lots of complicated factors, the reality is that the biblical theological response, at least in my mind, it is still fairly straightforward. And so I want to give you just a really quick kind of overview. Again, I'm not going to go deep into this because you can read that in your paper, but I try to alliterate it for us preachers. And so I've got 3 C's for the kind of the 3 main points. So first of all is the God, and it's moving from sort of an ethical, moral issue to the theology of humanity, to a theology of God. And so in the first order, of course, we talk about God's command, you shall not murder. Murder is the intentional ending of a human life without divine permission. That's kind of the definition that I've been working with. It's not just simply the intentional ending of a human life, because if you put a full stop period there, murder is the intentional ending of a human life, it introduces all kinds of other problems. Like, for example, in the Bible, there's times when obviously there seems to be some kind of divine permission during Israel's time, for example, where God actually ordered the intentional ending of others' lives. There's in the law, in the Torah, there's instances where punishments included the ending of a person's life, an intentional ending of a person's life. So murder is not just the intentional ending of a person's life, but it's the intentional ending of a person's life without divine permission. When you get to the New Testament, we also have to contend. I know that the EMCC has more of an Anabaptist, I understand, an Anabaptist background. And so you're going to read Romans 13, maybe just a little bit slightly different, but there are those texts like Romans chapter 13, where it seems like, at least in some instances, there are divine permissions for the state to bear the sword and to enact judgment in some way. So what we have to be careful about here is when we say, is MAiD murder? I believe that it is. I believe that it is. And that is because I don't see any justification scripturally where divine permission has been given for MAiD, for medical assistance in dying. And my main kind of argument there is that wherever divine permission was given to end a human life in scripture, it was always, almost, as far as I can see, I haven't seen any exceptions, it was always given as a means of enacting God's judgment. And if that's the case, we don't want to run with that logic, because if we're going to say that MAiD is an extension of the state, the bearing of the sword, that means that we're going to make some kind of argument that the people who are doing this, the doctors who are doing this, are in some way enacting the judgment of God against the people that they're doing MAiD. And that just seems like an utterly absurd and dangerous path to go down. So I'm trying to give nuance here to recognize that, yes, there are scriptural complexities when it comes to human ending another human's life, but in all those cases, whenever that happened, it was as a result of divine permission. I think that currently MAiD has been sanitized, right? We've sanitized what's happening. In the links at the end of the paper, there's a link to an article that I wrote for Faith Today a couple of years ago, where I come out, admittedly, I come out fairly strongly, but I somewhat argue that if we really realize what's going on when MAiD is taking place, someone is ending someone else's life. And for all intents and purposes, I don't know how else you can define that, but as murder, right? That's all. I can't find a way, not that I'm trying to, but I can't see a logical way around that. And so MAiD has been a sort of a professionally and legally sanitized moral action. We've professionally sanitized it by putting it within the medical profession. So we almost kind of divinize the medical profession in Canada. We hold the medical profession highly, although it's losing its respect. For a long time in Canada, like the medical profession was seen as a high calling, and I think it still is, but there's kind of an aura of professionalism and sanitary kind of ways of dealing with things in the medical world. And so since MAiD has been situated within the medical profession, that sanitization, that professionalization of the medical community brings with it, well, this is a medical procedure. And so therefore it blurs and sanitizes what's really going on behind the closed curtain, right? And people say, well, it's a medical procedure. And so therefore it protects us from really what's really going on. Legally, of course, there's also a subtle way, and we need to be always on guard against this. There's a subtle way where some people, many people, assume that because it's legal, therefore it has to be moral, right? And that's not necessarily the case. We just need to look through history and see how often totalitarian regimes of all kinds use legalization as a means of justifying what are otherwise highly immoral things to happen. I'm just reading a book about the history of the development of the atomic bomb, and how even in Germany, how Hitler, little by little legalized certain things and outlawed other things to uphold a particular kind of morality. And so we have to guard against this, because a lot of people still think, well, if it's legal, it's got to be moral. No, not necessarily. Second, what about the question, the argument, and this is a really, I think, a long-standing argument, or a not long-standing, but typical, I think, that I hear even Christians struggling, is that, isn't MAiD a compassionate way to end suffering? Aren't we called to do something about suffering? And that's a subtle argument, right? That's a subtle argument. And you can read a little bit more about this in the paper, but I conclude that I look in vain in Scripture to find support to the concept that ending a life is a means of ending suffering. I just don't see it. I just don't see it anywhere in Scripture. And as I was writing this paper, I came to reflect upon the story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. And I read it in a whole entirely new light as I was writing this paper. I mean, we've all read this story dozens of times, probably heard it told dozens of times. And when I came back to it, I came to realize what a crucial thing the parable of the Good Samaritan has to say about suffering. It's very interesting that the language that is used there, the Samaritan comes across a man who, in the Greek, it literally says, and translations do pick this up, he was half dead, demi thanatos. Okay, he was half dead. That is, he wasn't just hurt, he wasn't just injured, he was near death. To use the modern terms, his death was reasonably foreseeable, right? His death was reasonably foreseeable. But the Samaritan sees him, and it says that he had pity or compassion, depends on the translation. He had compassion on the man. And what I noticed about the Samaritan's response was this. The response was that it was terribly inconvenient, and it was financially burdensome to the Samaritan to do so, right? That it would have been economically much more feasible just to put him out of his misery. It would have been just as easy for him to do like the priest and the Levite, who walked around and just ignored the man, but instead he was inconvenienced, and severely, because he had to use his own donkey, his own oil, his own food. He even had to give extra finances to the innkeeper to take care of him. And he even promised that he would come back and pay whatever else was going to be to help this man. The point here is that the Good Samaritan, I think, reflects and teaches us that the response to suffering is not to hasten one's death, but to do everything possible to heal and to serve the person in their suffering. No guarantee that they'll live, but it's costly. It's a costly ministry to care for those who suffer. Let me jump forward here. The second part of the argument goes to that we are God's creatures. So there's the command. We can start right at the level of the moral imperative that thou shalt not murder. But why? Why don't we murder? And that goes to the nature of the human. So God's creature. We are humans. And of course, there's great, many of you are theologians and pastors here. We've all, know that there's lots of debates about what it means to be created in the image of God. What does that really mean? Okay, so there's lots of debates about how humans bear the image of God in Genesis chapter 1 and 26 and 27. But there's a virtual theological consensus among scholars that no matter how it is that we are image bearers of God, it is all agreed that we are in some way representatives of God as humans on earth. And so when you look at the larger context of the law, for example, the prohibition of forming graven images of God, like in the Ten Commandments, is because God doesn't want images of him, because why? Because humans are God's representation on earth. We are the image of God, right? And so that's why there's a prohibition against graven image. It's also why there's a prohibition against murder, because to murder is to attack the representative of God. It's a direct attack upon God's own representative. So murder is an attack on the divine representative. The commandment, the sum up, as we know, love God and love are summed up by the love God and love neighbor. And murder, amongst other sins listed especially in Romans chapter 13, for example, are fundamentally failures to love the neighbor. So not only is a failure to love your neighbor, it's also an attack on God's representative in Romans chapter 13, verses 9 and 10. Third, I got to keep moving here because I think I'm reaching close to my time already, Brian. I'll keep going though quickly. God is creator of Lord and judge. So it asks the question, why this command, thou shalt not murder? Well, because it's against God's creature, created in his image. And so that leads to the question, well, who is this God whom humans image, right? And we recognize that there's a distinct relationship between the creator and the created. And God has certain prerogatives that humans don't. Even though we're representatives, we don't have some of those prerogatives that God himself does. And three of those prerogatives are summed up by God as creator, Lord, and judge. And so the ultimate reason why the intentional ending of a person's life, even by a well-intentioned person who might see that act as mitigating against pain and suffering, why we have to reject that, because to take a life is to presume to do what is only God's prerogative to do. The giver of life, the creator and giver of life, the Lord and sustainer of life, and the judge of life, of those over life and death. To take a life is to try to take place of the giver, sustainer, and taker of life, who himself is God. God alone holds those prerogatives as creator, Lord, and judge. Ultimately, murder, we'll remember right early on in the biblical account. Of course, there's Adam and Eve's sin, but of course, the second sin that's recorded in the biblical account is murder, right? Is murder. Am I my brother's keeper? Cain says to God after he's killed Abel. And he asks it rhetorically, but actually the answer is yes. Yes, indeed, you are your brother's keeper. That's our job. It's our job to protect one another. But the temptation in the garden is you shall be like God, right? You shall be like God. And anything that we try to presume to do on our own, apart from God, what is God's prerogative, is sin. It's not our prerogative to take or to take away a life. It's not our job to judge whether a person's life is worth living anymore. That's not our job, right? And it's not even our job for ourselves. It's not our job for others, and it's not our job for ourselves. Although we might say, my life is my life and is my life, that's not true. He is the Lord of our lives. God is the Lord of our lives. It is not up to us to determine what we are to do or not to do with our life, because we are children of God. Brian, can you just jump in here?
Sure.
We're at about, I think we're about 35 minutes here. I've got, I wanted to highlight the 7 statements but I wanted to save some time for implications really quickly. So maybe what I'll do I have about 10 minutes yet?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, David. Yeah.
I won't spend a lot of time on this. These are found on page 11 of the paper. What I tried to do was to bring in 7 statements, of course, right? Because it's perfect 7 statements that tries to summarize a theological position that kind of covers the issue of MAiD. So what I'll probably do here is I'm just going to read them. I'm not going to expound on them. And then I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about implications, particularly for pastors and caregivers. So statement number 1, kind of think of these as 7 theses. In light of Jesus' own example of compassion and care for those in need, and some passages there, Isaiah, Matthew, Mark, and so on, we fully support human attempts to mitigate pain and suffering wherever it is compassionately and reasonably possible as an outworking of our belief that all humans are created in God's image and loved by him, and where we see such mitigation of suffering as an outworking of our love for God and our love for neighbor. Keeping in mind that the ending of suffering is not our option. It's the mitigation of suffering, the reducing of suffering as much as possible, but it's not our job to end suffering, especially by ending someone else's life. I wasn't going to expound on this, but simply to say that historically, Christianity, right from its early days, has always understood itself as giving care for those who are suffering, right from the earliest days. We see that in the book of Acts, and we see that all through the history. The rise of the modern medical system really owes itself to the Christian practices in many respects of caring for those who are sick and those who are suffering. Point 2, given the lack of biblical evidence to support the practice of dealing with suffering through ending of life, we oppose using MAiD as a means of ending suffering and pain, because the intentional ending of human life is both contrary to God's moral law and a form of attack against God's image-bearing creatures and against God himself. So that's kind of summarizing what I was talking about earlier. Third, we oppose MAiD in the form of euthanasia, an active or intentional hastening of death by a medical professional or anyone else, because to do so is to end a human created and loved by God in his image, and because the only divine permission permitted in Scripture is when an agent is working clearly with divine permission to bring about judgment on sin. Romans 13, for example. Fourth, we oppose MAiD in the form of assisted suicide, an active and intentional hastening of death of oneself through provision of means by a medical professional or anyone else, because killing oneself, a human created and loved by God in his image without divine permission, is nothing less than self-murder. The reformers, right through to the 20th century, Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox alike, all agreed that though the Bible has no explicit prohibition against suicide, they all theologically understood it as a form of self-murder. Okay, that suicide was a form, or taking one's own life is a form of murder. It's a self-murder. It's no different to kill yourself than it is to kill someone else. It's intentional and against the divine command. Fifth, we oppose MAiD in both forms of euthanasia and assisted suicide, because to agree or to encourage others to engage in MAiD is to be morally complicit with the intentional killing of a human without divine permission by the hand of another human who is also accountable to God for her or his moral action. This is a point that I've been raising that I don't see too many people raising, but it's a point that I think it's well worth considering. And that is this, that if I ask someone else to end my life, I am morally complicit in murder. And I am also morally complicit in causing or enticing someone else to do something that which is morally unacceptable. There's a kind of strange logic there that I think we've maybe sometimes overlooked is that if I ask someone else to kill me, I will be held accountable for that myself, for my own death, but I'll also be held accountable for enticing someone else to do something sinful. And so every time we accept MAiD, someone accepts MAiD, they've been morally complicit in someone else's sin as well, not just their own ending of life. So I think that's a really important line of moral inquiry that we have to continually raise. It's not just what I do, it's what I encourage others to do as well. I didn't get into this here. I didn't talk about palliative sedation or removal of hydration. Those are sort of separate issues, but they're all kind of related to those at the end of life. I won't talk about this too much, other than to say whether palliative sedation or removal of hydration and nutrition should be dealt with not as instances of MAiD. Some people have tried to say, well, it's no different than removing than palliative sedation, which sometimes ends a person's life a bit prematurely, or removing hydration and nutrition to a comatose patient or a vegetative state. That those are separate ethical issues, and I think each case needs to be dealt with spiritual discernment, but we should not confuse them as instances of MAiD, is what I'm arguing for. You can read a little bit more about that in the paper as well. And then lastly, we affirm the ability of the church to address the practice and expansion of MAiD in Canada, that the ability of the church to address the practice and expansion of MAiD in Canada will be to intentionally faithful to God's prohibition against intentional ending of human life, while also seeking to be attuned to ways in which we can bear one another's burdens, including sorry, I lost my place here. Those who walk through the sufferings of walking through the shadow of the valley of death, as an outworking of Christ's command to love our neighbor as ourselves. As the church demonstrates its commitment to support palliative care, which I think is one of our crucial responses, to supporting vulnerable persons, to speaking up and advocating for the helpless, MAiD will hopefully become the least desirable of all options for those who suffer. I think a ministry and theological strategy that we have to undertake is, given the fact that MAiD is already a reality, just like abortion is, because we live in a country where these are already a reality, it's not like we can pretend that they don't exist. The question becomes, what do we do in light of the fact that those are a reality? And I think our strategies need to be built around ways of thinking, how do we make MAiD, how do we make abortion the least desirable of all options, right? Barring its reversal legally, how do we ensure that a person who's suffering with a terminal illness actually sees MAiD as the least desirable of all options, right? How do we see someone who's contemplating an abortion? How do we come alongside that person and say, how do we make it so that abortion is the least desirable of all options? I think that's our strategy that we have to work with. In the paper, I talk a lot about implications, quite an extensive discussion of implications. I'm very concerned for the medical community. I work quite closely with the Christian Medical and Dental Association, have been working quite a bit with physicians on this. They're under tremendous pressures, and we have to find ways to support especially our Christian physicians. They work kind of in anonymity, kind of in isolation. Their confidentiality commitments and ethics means that they rarely share what they're facing in their practices. Somehow the church has to come along those. We have to pray for and strategize for Canadian families and friends. MAiD is ripping families apart. right? Because you have some family members who are supportive and some family members who aren't, right? And this is causing great pressure. And sometimes it's putting pressure on from the person themselves. It might be a person who's saying to their family, you know, I'm just going to end my life because I don't want to be a burden. And the family is saying, no, mom, dad, don't do that. We don't want you to do that. You're not a burden to us, right? So there's that. The vulnerable persons, we've been seeing so many in the news. Thankfully, we've been seeing some of these come to the public attention. Vulnerable persons, people who are homeless, opting for MAiD because it's easier than trying to eke out a living on the street, right? So how do we support vulnerable persons? And that's going to include certainly those with mental health issues and healthcare professionals, the physicians and those supporting the pharmacists, the ambulance drivers, all kinds of the home care workers, all kinds of people who are being asked questions about this and being forced to kind of make decisions about how they're going to respond. And then with pastors and caregivers, you know, it wasn't my job. I didn't think it was my job in this paper to give all those answers, because it's not my job to give all of those answers. But I would hope that all of you would look at page 13 and 14, where I actually have 6 questions for the pastoral community, for pastoral and spiritual caregivers. I think that denominations need to do a lot of work on helping to develop sort of thoughtful policies and practices surrounding MAiD. These are new things that pastors haven't had to deal with. The seminaries haven't caught up to this yet. They're going to have to, the seminaries are going to have to start training their pastors how to respond to these situations. They add a kind of a level of pastoral complexity that we don't have to face in many other issues. We have to ask the question, number 1 on page 13, you know, what's the theology of suffering that we're working with? Is suffering an ultimate evil that needs to be eradicated at all costs? If that's the theology of suffering that we're working with, then of course MAiD becomes a viable solution. But if suffering has some kind of perhaps a redemptive purposes, Christ himself suffered. Is there a redemptive purpose? There's different types of theologies of suffering that we're going to have to be working with. Secondly, what should pastors and teachers be saying and doing to congregants who come to them and ask them about MAiD? Are we prepared to discuss it with our congregants? What are we going to say to them? What are we going to do when they opt for it? Right? Because they will. Some of you have probably already faced that. And that leads to question 3. You know, what is morally and theologically acceptable for a pastor to do for a person, Christian or not, who's opted to participate in MAiD? Is it moral complicity to accompany a person through the procedure? The Catholic Church has spoken to this, and the bishops have said that a priest is not allowed to be present alongside a person who has opted for MAiD, because of course for Catholics that's suicide and a mortal sin. And for a priest to be present and blessing that would be going against the teaching of the church. You can understand their logic. It's actually kind of a pretty sound logic. But that's a tough line to walk when someone says, Pastor, will you come and be with me unto the end? Will you come into the room with me while they administer this? What are we going to say? Does it matter whether they're a believer or not? And so on and so forth. These are tough questions that I think we're going to need some guidance on. What's our responsibility, a pastor's responsibility on page 14, to those in his congregation who are in the medical profession and are dealing with this? What guidance or support are we offering to them? How do you, number 5, do a funeral for this? You see, previously, when a pastor faced someone who had committed suicide and the family comes to them for a funeral, it's relatively clear cut. It's not easy, but it's clear cut that everybody knows what this funeral is about. This is a tragic death. That's not so clear cut now when half the family is saying, well, this was a good option for the person and we're celebrating their life. And the other half of the family is seeing this as a premature act of murder. How are we going to run a funeral when you have half the people saying this was a good thing and half the people saying this was a moral tragedy. This is a new situation, which is very different than just suicide, as tragic as suicide is. And how can pastors care for families who are opting for MAiD, especially families who may be divided by the decision? So those are just some of the questions that I think we're going to have to address. I have spoken far too long already, but I hope that it's been good to get us going in terms of our discussion. So I'm going to pass it off to you, Brian. Thank you for giving me the extra leeway here.
Yeah, thanks so much, David, for helping us work and listen through this. Again, we've asked David to present this as a discussion topic, and by the way, I want to thank a team who did this with our SALT committee that were putting this together, and the team who led that and kind of did some editing. So I truly appreciate that, and appreciate you, David, in leading us through this. There have been some questions in the chat already. One of the questions was, are physicians able to decline performing MAiD based on conscience?
Sort of.
Okay.
It depends on the province. So Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia, their professional colleges of physicians have adopted guidelines that say a physician cannot conscientiously object. They do not have to participate directly in the provision of MAiD, but they have to provide what's been called here in Ontario an effective referral. That is, they're responsible to make sure that the procedure is carried out by another physician. So they're actually kind of bound to make sure that the person, it's not just a simple referral. It's caused all kinds. They've been fighting this since 2015, but it's caused all kinds of problems because a physician can't just simply say, well, I just don't do MAiD. So if someone comes to the physician and says, I want MAiD, and if you're in Ontario, Quebec, or Nova Scotia, you have to ensure that the patient is transferred and receives the procedure. And so a lot of the physicians have been arguing that this is a kind of moral complicity. So I'm not going to rob the bank, but I'm going to give you a gun so you can go do it. Right.
Okay.
That's kind of the problem. So conscience is protected to a degree. You don't have to actually do it yourself, but you have to be an aider or an abetter in Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Other provinces have better. Manitoba probably has the strongest conscience protection legislation, and so we can be grateful for that. The Christian Medical and Dental Association has been working hard on these issues, and so every province needs to have some kind of conscience legislation or protection, because medicine, of course, is there's federal criminal code, but the medical professions are guided by provincial regulations. So every province has to have their own kind of guidelines, and that's all usually dictated through the colleges.
Yeah, and just along with that, is there a requirement in certain circumstances that a medical professional is required to say that MAiD is an option? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is like, do they have to bring that on the table as an option?
So they're not supposed to. Physicians aren't supposed to bring MAiD up. But there's no way to really monitor that fully unless they get reported, right? So we know for a fact that this is happening, that professionals are suggesting this as an option. Legally, they're not supposed to. The patient is the one who's supposed to raise and say, hey, I hear that this is available. Can I get it? Then the doctor can have that conversation. But the doctor is not supposed to put it on the table as an option, right? But we know for a fact that's happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay. Somebody else asked, what's the quickest time that you know from someone asking for MAiD and then receiving MAiD? Somebody said that in Red Deer, it just took 5 days. Like it was a very quick process for them. So is there a time thing involved here?
So there's no minimal time as long as there is, it's really more of a practicality of time, but there's no theoretical kind of minimal time. I do know that I had a conversation with a chaplain in Manitoba a few months ago. Actually, there was an interview with in Didascalia, the journal from Providence Seminary. They did an interview with me, a chaplain, a doctor. There was about 4 of us, and an ethicist on MAiD. The spiritual director, the spiritual chaplain, knows of a case of someone in his hospital that he was serving at, where the person asked for MAiD in the morning and got it in the afternoon.
Wow.
Now that's more an exception likely than typical, but theoretically it can be done as long as theoretically and practically, if they can get the right signatures and there's someone available to do it, it can be done the same day.
Wow. Now, again, if you do have other questions, just put them in the chat. We're not wanting to extend this too long. I just appreciate David's time here. So what do you see, David, maybe in your own personal experience, as one of the the biggest challenges maybe that you've had in a whether it's a personal experience that you've had of this, in coming into an instance where MAiD has come to the forefront in your own experience? What's the biggest challenge that you've had to face?
Well, I mean, as far as maybe not so much a personal challenge that I've faced, but we came face to face with it. My wife was in hospital just before COVID. She spent 5 days in hospital, and this was probably February 20, I think it was. And the woman in the bed next to us in the room, an elderly woman, had requested MAiD, and the family was coming to see her before she received MAiD. And it was absolutely heart-wrenching, heart-tearing, heartbreaking to see it happen. It's really there. I kind of got attuned to how this is really got the potential to really tear families apart, even families that are otherwise maybe close and stable, can be so torn apart from this. And what happened there was some of the family members came in, they really didn't know what to say, but they were trying to support, grandma and say, okay, well, you've made this choice and we love you. And then a couple of one family member came in, he'd flown in from the States, and he wept bitterly at the bedside and pleaded with her not to go through with it. And the other family members were a little bit embarrassed by this, and they tried to shuffle him out of the room, and he got angry, all in front of this woman, right? So I think that it just struck home to me that, the church, caregivers, pastors, we're going to have to deal, we're the ones going to be dealing with that. You're the ones who are going to be dealing with that. And not only at the bedside, and it's in coming up to it, like even the conversations about it, as people are maybe preparing wills and preparing, those are maybe good times to be having those conversations, but those are times that are going to suddenly become really, really potentially family dividing, when suddenly someone says, well, if I ever get to that position, I'm just going to end my life. I'm just going to ask MAiD, the doctor, to end my life. And the kids are like, what are you talking about? So I think that I really have a heart for the pastoral challenges that lay ahead. even I've just been thinking, I mentioned it earlier in the presentation, like how a pastor performs a funeral of a person who's taken MAiD is going to be really, really delicate. It's going to be really difficult because, you know, some people in the room are going to support what happened and other people are going to be, you know, dead set against it. And pardon the pun, I didn't mean that. But they're going to be, you know, they're going to be really against this, and it's going to be traumatic. It's going to be traumatic. At least when it was a suicide, everybody knew the status of what we're dealing with, as tragic as it was. At least we all could understand commonly what we're dealing with here. I've actually performed funerals for a couple funerals for suicides in my early career, and at least everybody knew it was a suicide and that it was tragic, and nobody thought that what should have happened. So you see, you have that commonality. In this case, you don't have that commonality. If someone dies of terminal illness, we all know the status of what brought that about. If someone dies in a car accident, we all know the status of what brought that out, and we can all agree it was a tragic. This, we can't agree.
Yeah, thanks, David. I'll just ask one more question and then we're gonna close. We have well, one question is, would we be able to access your PowerPoint? Now, if you're using it other places, maybe not, but you could send it to me.
This PowerPoint was for this paper, so I'll send it to you, Brian.
Okay, and we'll post it on our website for sure. So one final question, just if you could explain further non-consenting euthanasia when you were talking about it at the beginning. Do you mean someone who's non-responsive, or is this happening against their will? Like, just clarify that.
Yeah. So there are ethicists who are talking about, you know, in certain cases. So right now, in Canada, and this is actually part of the controversy that people are raising, in Canada, you have to consent even in the moments before. It's the law that the physician has to ask, are you consenting to what is about to happen? And the patient needs to consent. This has raised issues for people who say, well, and you can't give advance directives either.
Okay.
So you can't say, you know, if I ever get to that place, I want to have MAiD. You can't do that either, right? The non-consenting question is there a time when physicians could make the judgment call and say, this person can no longer consent and there's no chance of recovery, so therefore we should just, you know, end their life. So there is some serious ethical debates going on about that. And there's evidence that it happens already in certain cases. And I'm not going to obviously reveal particularities, but it's almost for certain has already happened in Canada. It is illegal, but it has happened where physicians have ended someone's life, you know, at that point. You know, it's obviously terminal. It's obviously near the end of their life, and they've hastened their death. So that's what we're talking about with non-consenting.
All right. All right. Well, thank you again so much, David. Again,
Thank you.
The paper, I think Krista put the link online where the video will be, and we'll put the PowerPoint there as well. Krista, if you could just come back and give us some final follow-up, and then we'll be dismissed. We have a few announcements. Thanks, Krista.
All right. Thanks again, David, and to the SALT team for making this conversation available. Thanks to everybody for being here with us. Just a couple of quick announcements about upcoming things, and then I'm going to give a benediction before we all head off here today. We've got General Assembly coming up, and registration opens on February 1st. So that's just a heads up that it's going to be in Ontario, in Stouffville. So to kind of make plans ahead of time, that's helpful. We have another one of these EMCC Connected events coming up, and it's about being a trauma-informed church, and that's coming up February 9th. So feel free to register for that at emcc.ca at our website. And the third thing is we have another GC2 coaching workshop that'll be coming up. That's March 14th and 15th. It'll be 2 half days. And we just encourage you that if you need to polish up on those coaching skills, if you've done it 15 years ago and want to do it again, or if you've never done it before, or if anyone in your congregation wants to do it, that's for everybody who might want some coaching training. So those are some upcoming things happening here in our EMCC family. Without further ado, I'm just going to bless us and off we go to the rest of our day. And so I'm just going to bless you with Romans 15:13 out of the Amplified. Friends, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing through the experience of your faith, that by the power of the Holy Spirit, you will abound in hope and overflow with confidence in his promises. Amen. Bless you all, friends. Thanks again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you all.
Blessings.